There's a new rumor out there about what the Jets might do in the 2025 NFL draft, and I got to say, I think it's the worst idea I've heard all offseason. Let's discuss the move the Jets should not make today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Monday, April 7th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. On today's show, we're going to talk about Jets players who could be impacted by what the team does with the 7th overall pick in the 2025 NFL draft, which is just a couple of weeks away. And we're going to start with a rumor that kind of made the rounds over the weekend. Rich Cimini of ESPN discussed some comments Aaron Glenn made last week that we actually discussed these comments Glenn made on the show, where Glenn talked about how it sounds like he was saying that there's going to be a timeshare arrangement where the Jets are going to split the carries between the three backs there, Breece Hall, Braylon Allen, and Isaiah Davis. And that would be a change because over the last couple of years, Breece Hall has been the number one back. He's been the clearly defined go-to guy, and Aaron Glenn kind of suggested that the team was going to do more of a timeshare arrangement in the backfield. So Rich Cimini took those comments and he threw out some speculation about what it could mean. I think Cimini's comments were all pretty reasonable. You know, he wondered if it was a mechanism to try and motivate Breece Hall. You know, maybe get a little fire in Breece Hall. Cimini also speculated, and this is kind of what's caught fire, that if the Jets drafted Ashton Jeanty, the running back out of Boise State, at 7, maybe Breece Hall could be on the trade block. Now, I don't think anything Cimini said was really that outrageous. I think, you know, he was raising some hypotheticals, but the internet has really run with this rumor, which was just, it was just kind of throwing a scenario out there. And now I'm seeing all over the internet, you know, rumor insider suggests Jets may trade Breece Hall, which I think if you were reading the article was not what Rich Cimini said. It was, you know, kind of a hypothetical, but I think it is worth discussing because I think we have to ponder all possibilities in the 2025 NFL draft. First, what I would say is that I don't think drafting Ashton Jeanty should impact much what the Jets do with Breece Hall. I think that Breece Hall is an interesting decision the team has to make. As for me, like Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson are no-brainers. You re-sign them this offseason. Breece Hall's a tougher evaluation because he has flashed, certainly. He's shown moments where he's been great, but he has been inconsistent through his career. And he also plays running back, a position that, while there were obviously some really good free agent signings this year, it's a position you usually don't want to pay a lot of money to. So, I mean, I think for Breece Hall, there's a dollar amount where he'd make sense for the Jets, dollar amount where he probably would not. But I think in a world where the Jets draft Ashton Jeanty, I don't think that necessarily means you should move on from Breece Hall. I think there'd be a price where Breece Hall would make sense, and then you'd have the 1-2 punch, Jeanty and Hall. Now, I will say I like Ashton Jeanty, but I don't like Ashton Jeanty at 7. I think, you know, if you traded down pretty far traded down, and I'm not just like 1 or 2 slots, I'm talking a big trade down, there's a point where I would take Jeanty. I would not draft Jeanty at 7. And this goes back to something I've been discussing with Tyler Warren. There's something to be said for positional value. I think there are a couple different angles to this. Number one is the financial angle. You know, part of the benefit of the first round pick is that you're getting a player typically at a steep discount for what it would cost to find a quality starter in the free agent market. That effect goes down at the running back position. Now, the Jets right now pick 7th overall. So the player they draft, regardless of position, if they stay at 7, is going to make just under $7 million a year on a 4-year contract. Well, if the Jets drafted a wide receiver, just under $7 million, that would make them the 40th highest paid wide receiver. Jets draft a tackle. It would be the 42nd highest paid tackle. Running back, it'd only be the 15th highest paid running back. So you're not really getting a discount. You're essentially paying for a league median running back. That's really not a very good deal. Now, if you draft Jeanty and he's really good, and there's still value there. But if you draft Jeanty and he's the 10th best running back in the league, well, he's only getting paid like the 15th best running back. You draft a wide receiver and he's the 10th best receiver, well, he's being paid like the 40th. You draft a tackle and he's paid like he's the 10th best tackle. He's the 42nd highest paid tackle. There's not as much excess value. And this goes into, one of the big reasons I think positional value exists in the NFL is there are only so many players who make a huge impact. People say, well, if a running back is as good as advertised, then he'll be an impact player. And that's true. But there just aren't as many impact running backs as there are impact players at positions like wide receiver or tackle. Let's take wide receiver, for example. Last year, 21 wide receivers had 1,000 yards receiving. I think you could say that if you draft a receiver who goes for 1,000 yards consistently, that's worth the 7th overall pick. You could be, and that was the 21st most productive receiver last year. At the running back position, the guy and I know like rushing yards isn't the best way to judge running backs, but it'll put us in the ballpark. The running back with the 21st highest amount of rushing yards was J.K. Dobbins. I don't think J.K. Dobbins is worth the 7th overall pick. J.K. Dobbins is a nice player. He's not worth the 7th overall pick. And this goes back to another concept I've discussed a lot about the tight end position. It can be difficult to judge the difference between good and great. There's an old expression from NASA, during when they had the space shuttle project back when they had the Apollo project that went to the moon. And I'm sorry, I'm probably going to butcher this line, but it's something to the effect of, if you miss by an inch landing on the moon, it's not a big deal. If you miss by an inch on takeoff, you're in big trouble. And that can be applied to positional value in the NFL. If you miss, if you draft a guy thinking he's going to be Justin Jefferson and he's only Garrett Wilson at the wide receiver position, at 7th overall, that's still fine. Garrett Wilson's worth the 7th overall pick, even though he's not a top 10 guy at his position. If you draft a running back thinking he's going to be Saquon Barkley, and he's only J.K. Dobbins, that's a problem, because J.K. Dobbins, while he's a good player, is not worth the 7th overall pick. And the other aspect of this is and I think Jeanty is going to be really good, but you just should not need to use a top 10 pick to get a running back. I actually went through the list of running backs who've been named to the All-Pro team recently. So either first or second team All-Pro. Last 5 years, only Saquon Barkley and Josh Jacobs were drafted in the first round. Other guys went in round 2. Derrick Henry was a second-round pick. Jonathan Taylor was a second-round pick. Alvin Kamara was a third-round pick. Whereas at the wide receiver position, in 2024 alone, so I went back 5 years and found only 2 running backs who were All-Pro first or second team. In 2024 alone, there were 3 wide receivers: Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb. Now, there are more wide receivers chosen for these All-Pro teams than there are running backs, so that factors in. But the point is, you don't need to get an elite running back. You should not have to use a first-round pick. So, look, I'm going to throw it out there. I like Ashton Jeanty as a player. I don't mind Ashton Jeanty if there's a big trade down, if we move to the late first round, but I'm not drafting any running back high in the first round. If the Jets hypothetically drafted Jeanty and he was like a top 3 running back, of course he'd be worth the pick. But there's a lot of risk and there's a lot more upside at other positions. And I would say no matter what happens at the running back position, Breece Hall, I think that even if the Jets drafted a running back, that should not impact the Breece Hall decision. Breece Hall's a player who's worth it for the Jets at one price, not worth it at another. Now, head on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to a scenario that I would find more palatable. If the Jets drafted a wide receiver, I think it could have a big impact on the roster status of one player. I think Jets fans would be very happy about what would happen to this player, because this is not a popular player. We'll discuss it in more detail continuing here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now, Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is Taxes. Get an expert now at TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today we're focusing on players who could be impacted by what the Jets do with the 7th overall pick in the 2025 NFL draft. And it really depends on which player the Jets end up selecting. Let's turn our attention now to the wide receiver position. Now, I think at 7, the most likely player the Jets would pick would be Ted McMillan out of Arizona. And I almost hesitate to do this segment because after what I'm about to say, I think everybody's going to be on board the Ted McMillan bandwagon. I think everybody's going to want a wide receiver after what I'm about to say, because I think the player who would be most impacted would be Allen Lazard. And I think the way he would be impacted is that he would almost certainly be cut because if the Jets were to draft Ted McMillan 7th overall, my guess is that they would count on him to be the number 2 receiver right off the bat. Now, obviously, Garrett Wilson's going to be your number 1 guy. But I think you draft a guy in the top 10, you would probably hope, you probably would be counting on him to be your number 2 receiver at the very least. And that turns Allen Lazard into a very expensive number 3 receiver. And, he's going to count for 13. He's set to count for $13.184 million against the cap. So we'll round up $13.2 million against the cap. I think it's very difficult under almost any circumstances to carry a number 3 receiver with a $13.2 million cap hit. It's awfully expensive for a player of that role. Now, I think you might say, well, John, Allen Lazard's not worth $13.2 million, even if he's the number 2 receiver. And I agree with you, my friend. I am not entirely sure why the Jets have not cut him yet. Now, I guess you could say he's got a better resume than the other players on the roster, but the fact of the matter is, look at what he's done the last 2 years. And I find it a little odd that the Jets are so focused on, let's just say hypothetically, maybe he's a little bit better than Tyler Johnson and Josh Reynolds. I don't know that I buy that, but we've seen across the board this offseason that the Jets have not really been focused on incremental improvements. This is a Jets regime that has taken a very, very cautious approach to the 2025 offseason. And I think rightly so. I mean, I think that this is a year where Jets are going to have to reset in a way. And that doesn't mean that the Jets are going to go out and lose games on purpose. It doesn't mean that the Jets are going to not try and win games. The Jets are going to try and get good results in the present. It's just things are more slanted to the future. And this was always the way it was going to be. I mean, look, I think everybody acknowledged when the Jets traded for Aaron Rodgers 2 years ago that they were loading up for the next season or two, and 2025 was going to be the year where, they would have to kind of reset because they were going to borrow resources from future years to try and load up around Rodgers. 2025 was going to be the year where they'd have to maybe take a step back, and 2025 has obviously arrived. So with that in mind, I'm sitting here wondering a little bit why, even hypothetically, if Lazard is a small upgrade on the other guys, what he's still doing around here. But I think in a scenario where Ted McMillan is drafted, Lazard's ticket's almost certainly punched out of town. I mean, the Jets would get hit with some dead money, but they'd save $6.6 million in cap space, which ironically, I don't think this is, the deciding force, but ironically, that $6.6 million in cap savings, that's almost like the salary of what the Jets are going to pay the 7th overall pick over the course of his contract. Now, it's actually the breakdown's a little bit different. I averaged it out. The rookie contract's actually a lower cap number, and the cap hits progressively get bigger we get deeper into the rookie contract. So it's the seventh overall pick is actually going to have a lower cap number than $7 million this year. But then it keeps rising. But that's kind of ironic. I mean, I think the other factor here would be that it would, if the Jets draft Ted McMillan, it's less reps that go to some of the other younger receivers on the roster. And I'm talking about Xavier Gipson and Malachi Corley. And, these are not guys with a ton of upside. Whenever I talk about Xavier Gipson, I feel obligated to mention that touchdown returning against the Bills his first game, because I feel like that's a game that deserves to live in Jets lore. It was the game where Aaron Rodgers got injured, and the Jets put together a really gutty comeback win over Buffalo, a Buffalo team that ended up being really good. And of course, the Jets really did not have much of a great season in 2023. But if you look back at that 2023 season, one of the clear highlights was that opening night game where Xavier Gipson had the punt return for a touchdown in overtime. But since then, 2 years worth of games, we really have not seen much to suggest Xavier Gipson is going to be a player in this league. That's true on offense. It's true on special. I mean, he really has not been that dynamic as a return guy since that opener. And as for Corley, new coaching staff, which, could be good. It could be bad for him. I mean, it doesn't seem like the Jets coaching staff last year really had much interest in playing Corley. And it's tough to blame them, because Corley really did not do much with what limited opportunities he got. I mean, the biggest play was the Thursday night Halloween game against Houston, where he took the ball on the end around, had a walk-in touchdown block for him, and dropped the ball. And of course, one play doesn't define your career. But Corley was a guy when the Jets drafted him. I thought he was going to be a huge project. I was very bearish on the idea he was going to contribute as a rookie. There were lots of people who really thought he was going to be a big part of the offense. And I never really understood that if you looked at the way the Jets were set up, but also if you looked at what Corley did in college, because Corley was a guy who really just did not run routes. And when you draft a guy who did not run routes, and it's one thing to be a raw route runner. I mean, Corley's most of the incredible amount of his production was just based off screens. That was the offenses college ran. And when you have a guy like that, it's a big transition to the NFL. It's no small thing to get ready to play in the National Football League. So I always felt like, it was going to be, Corley's just kind of almost like a lottery ticket. You're hoping he pans out. I think that Corley was kind of like the classic Joe Douglas pick, where Joe Douglas thought he could out-scout everybody. He thought he could find something that nobody else could find. And occasionally he could, and we'll find out about Corley, because I'm not ready to write him off just yet. But sometimes Joe Douglas got in his own way by overthinking things, and I wonder if that's what happened with Corley. If Ted McMillan's around, I mean, that's just the guy that pushed. That's just another young receiver to kind of take a slot. A guy that might take opportunities away from some of these younger guys, because the Jets will have a receiver in here that this regime drafted. And when and a GM and head coach typically favor their own picks over the previous regime's picks. But ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to what's a pretty big hole, and arguably the biggest hole on the team. What happens if the Jets draft a tackle? Which player would be most impacted? I think there's a clear answer to this, and it's a player who is nothing but a question mark. I think it's a player who's better off, might be better off if the Jets drafted a tackle, and I'll explain all that continuing here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Monarch Money. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. And that's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is not just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you can stop managing your money and start building wealth. When you use Monarch Money, you'll realize just how much you're spending on food delivery. Now you can budget smarter and save more. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. Managing money with your partner is smoother than ever. You can track shared and personal accounts, set goals, and stay on the same page without the stress. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Monday, we're talking about the upcoming NFL draft. Depending on what the Jets do at 7, there are players on the roster who could be impacted in a big way. Let's talk now about what happens if the Jets draft a tackle with the 7th overall pick. And In some ways, drafting a tackle might be a bit controversial because they just drafted a tackle last year, Olu Fashanu. People might wonder why would you do that? Well, it's not easy to find offensive linemen in today's NFL. And in the past, I think you could make an argument that left tackle was the premium position and the only premium position on the offensive line. But I think those days are over. I think, if you look across the league, it's fair to say that it's completely justifiable to draft a right tackle in the top 10. And I think a couple factors in this. Number one, as I mentioned, it's very difficult to find quality offensive linemen. There's certain positions you can get on the open market. I say this every year, and it always ends up being true. If you need a safety, there's always like somebody who the market falls out for in free agency who's available for league minimum in like June. There's always a safety available. On the other hand, if you want to get a tackle, good luck. I mean, any good tackle is locked up by their team, before they hit the market, because tackles just aren't easy to come by. So there's an argument to be made that, you have to draft it. You have to draft and develop a tackle. Now, some teams are able to find quality tackles and develop them later on in the draft. Sometimes, a guy takes a couple of years to develop. There are late bloomers on the offensive line. Sometimes teams will sign a guy who maybe got off to a rough start in his career, but after a couple of years worth of reps, he's ready to blossom. He turns into a late bloomer. But I don't think there's a problem with drafting a tackle, a right tackle in the top 10. I mean, that's what Detroit did with Penei Sewell in 2021. And then, of course, now I'm not saying that Aaron Glenn's going to run the Jets the exact same way the Detroit Lions have been run, but Aaron Glenn was with the Lions during that time. And I think Aaron Glenn can see that, Aaron Glenn saw how well that worked for Detroit. Detroit in 2021 really focused on the trenches by drafting Penei Sewell. Now, there's a couple guys available for the Jets who could be there at 7. The guy who keeps rising up the boards is Armand Membu out of Missouri. Also, Will Campbell out of LSU. Although, I've been referring to Campbell as like the guy who's been the consensus top tackle prospect, but there are some concerns about his ability to play tackle now because maybe his arm length isn't what people were expecting. And at the tackle position, sometimes arm length does matter. It's not like necessarily a deal breaker. I mean, Joe Thomas was the legendary tackle with the Browns, one of the greatest tackles to ever play. I mean, he had relatively short arms, but at the tackle position, you typically want somebody who can reach out and get that first punch on an edge rusher, and you want to be able to get that first punch without leaning, which means you want somebody with longer arms, because if you lean, you get thrown off balanced. You have to be balanced, because in the NFL, if you play in the trenches off balance, someone's going to use a great technique and just kind of throw you off the ball. But I think the clear guy who would be impacted if the Jets drafted a right tackle 7th overall would be Chukwuma Okorafor, who the Jets just signed from New England. And I say this with some trepidation, but if you're looking at this Jets team right now, season began today, he's the starting right tackle. The other option would be starting Josh Myers, who they signed from Green Bay, at center, moving Joe Tippmann to right guard, and moving Elijah Vera Tucker to right tackle. Aaron Glenn said they're not going to do that, though. The Jets are pretty set on AVT being a guard, which I think is the right move. I mean, it would be kind of crazy to me that after Tippmann has a good year at center and AVT has a good year at right guard, we decide to move both of their positions. That would not make a lot of sense to me. And I say this as somebody who, for a couple of years wasn't sure where Tippmann would end up and wasn't sure where AVT would end up, because, there was a case maybe Tippmann would be better at guard. There was an argument if AVT could play tackle, maybe you get more value out of him there. Not necessarily that he'd be better at tackle, but there's more value at tackle than there is a guard. So if AVT could hold up at tackle, maybe that's where he'd play. Well, Jets have ruled that out, and I think smartly so. I think that, what guys show you that they've got a home at a certain place. Tippmann showed you he's got a home at center. AVT showed you he's got a home at right guard. Don't mess with that. The thing is, that does mean Okorafor is penciled in to start. And as I said, when the Jets signed him, as a low-cost move around the veteran minimum, as a depth guy, I like it. He's a guy who's shown he can play at least to some extent in this league. As a starter, that I don't like. Guy's been benched 2 straight years. Guy barely played last year. It's one thing to have a guy with 3.5 years of starting experience who's still not that old. I mean, he's only going to be 28 when the season starts, so he's still kind of like at the tail end of what a prime would look like. But the guy who also hasn't played that well the last couple of years, and even when at his best wasn't that great. I mean, if you have a guy with his track record as your primary backup tackle, that's fine. He's probably better than most of the number 3 tackles in the league. At least got experience. He has some track record of playing decent football, even if it was in the past. I don't love him as a starter, though. So I think if like you were, and one of the things I talk a lot about on this show is how you can't just use the draft to focus on immediate needs. You have to focus on building strengths. Well, if the Jets draft right tackle, you could argue that like they're doing a little bit of both because they're fortifying the trenches, a critical spot. You want to be very solid on the offensive line, but right tackle right now is also an issue. I don't blame the Jets for not giving more. I don't blame the Jets for letting Morgan Moses leave, because I would not have given a 3-year contract to a 34-year-old tackle who's showing signs of slowing down and who's showing signs of his body breaking down. But there aren't really a lot of great options if the Jets don't take a tackle at 7. So that's certainly a case to do it. And Okorafor, that's a guy who's, starting job hangs in the balance. And got to say, I would not be upset to see the Jets replace him at the starting tackle spot. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and you're listening on the podcast for us, please a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.